You're unbelievable.
Well, today on the show, we're discussing C.S. Lewis, JRR Tolkien and Owen Barfield, how the Inklings made sense of faith, joined today by Mark, Vernon and Malcolm Guite. Now, the Inklings was the name adopted by a small group of academics and writers who, in the 1930s to the 50s, met regularly to talk literature, philosophy and faith at the Eagle and Child pub in Oxford. It was there that early drafts of The Lord of the Rings by JRR Tolkien and the Narnia Chronicles by C.S. Lewis were first read and critiqued, and other writers such as Owen Barfield, Charles Williams and Hugo Dyson were also regular contributors. Well, today on the show we're going to be talking about some of the philosophical and theological influences some of those members brought to that group. Lewis and Tolkien, of course, well known. Owen Barfield less so, but he greatly influenced Lewis's own journey towards Christian faith. And to talk about this, I'm joined by writer and philosopher Mark Vernon and poet theologian Malcolm Guite. In his new book, A Secret History of Christianity, Jesus, the Last Inkling and the Evolution of Consciousness, Mark Vernon charts how Barfield's view of Jesus has been integral in his own story of making sense of faith. He says his view is not a demythologizing or liberal one, but it's really about a radical transformation of perception and consciousness. We'll find out more about that shortly. Malcolm Guite is ordained in the Church of England, a poet and a musician and a chaplain at Girton College, Cambridge. He's the author of books such as Mariner, A Voyage with Samuel Taylor Coleridge. In fact, if you search back in the Profile archive, our other podcast from Premier Christian Radio, you'll probably find my interview with Malcolm about his life, faith and Mariner. But Malcolm is someone who's familiar with Barfield's thought and poetry. He'll be engaging with Mark today. So Malcolm and Mark, welcome along to the programme today.
Good to be here.
It's great to have you both in studio with me for this. I just think this is going to be a most fascinating conversation between the three of us today. I'm looking forward to learning a lot as well in the course of it from you both. Let's introduce you first of all, Mark. You've been on the show, but a number of years ago, and the last time you were actually in was to talk about a book you'd written on agnosticism. And at the time you were identifying as an agnostic. But you're here today to talk about how you're kind of gradually putting the pieces together a bit further down the journey, as it were. So tell us what's happened in the intervening years since you were last on the show.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's very nice to be back. And I mean, in a way, Barfield has happened to me in the intervening years. I was a certain kind of agnostic. I wasn't I don't know, whatever kind of agnostic. I was an agnostic, a searching agnostic, kind of hovering on the brink, as it were, and found figures like Socrates really inspirational in that position. And when I look back now, I think one of the problems which I perhaps always had with Christianity, I was a kind of cradle Christian, brought up in a Christian family, Christians all around me.
You even had a spell where you were looking at ordination in the Church of England.
Well, I was an Anglican priest, actually. Right, yeah. So I did a sort of 3-year curacy, as it's called, as an Anglican priest. But one of my struggles always was the figure of Jesus, in fact, which might sound strange for a Christian, but I never really had problems with an awareness of God. In my agnostic phase, I wandered, but, looking back, that has always felt like a keen presence to me. But I really did struggle to get a deep sense of Jesus, if you like. So, the story of Jesus, clearly moving, especially as it's enacted in liturgies, there's no problem with that. Jesus as an important figure in our culture, no problem with that, a moral teacher. But when it came to, the way that Jesus actually changes the fabric of reality, you might say, the really deep theological stuff, I always struggled with that. And it was Barfield's take on that which finally made me feel like this is an account of it which I can really own and experience directly myself.
That's really interesting. We'll obviously get into the depth of that shortly when we come to talk about the book and kind of what you lay out there as your way forward. Great pleasure to also introduce to the show Malcolm Guite. Malcolm, lovely to have you on. Someone I've wanted to have on this programme for a long time because whenever I do anything around imagination when it comes to apologetics and theology, people often bring your name up and say, I love the poetry of Malcolm Guite and that sort of thing. But you've been, in a sense, marrying both the imagination, the poetry and so on with pastoral side of what you do. So just would you encapsulate just quickly what you do now, how you got to do it and why you love doing it?
Okay, so I was I'm very lucky in that I'm having, as it were, my third go at Cambridge. Or my third I came up, actually, to Cambridge as an agnostic myself, also having been brought up in faith, but having sort of rejected it for largely, I mean, both for emotional, but also for intellectual reasons. I didn't think it was the case. But then, of course, I began to read some proper philosophy and read Augustine and things that came. But my first love then, and still one of my deepest love, was simply poetry, just delighting in poetry and myth and storytelling. And I realised that was preparing me for a deeper encounter with Christ. And I love the phrase in C.S. Lewis's Surprised by Joy, where he says, I suppose in a way my imagination was baptised before I was, and the rest of me just took a bit longer to catch up. So I became a Christian in my final years at Cambridge. I went off, I was an English teacher after that for a while, and I loved doing that. But then I realised God was, in fact, calling me to the priesthood. So I had another go at Cambridge and came back and read theology. And actually, funnily enough, one of the things I found quite disturbing about reading theology was the way the Bible was read was very analytical, very taking it all into bits and leaving the bits on the floor. And either on the one hand you had people being very literalistic in a sort of slightly naive way, or on the other hand you had people being hyper-analytical. But nobody seemed to be reading the Bible poetically or imaginatively or letting it soak into them. So in a way, I then found myself reading the Inklings and Barfield and Coleridge almost to help me cope with the dryness
That's interesting.
of that theological training. So then I went off and was ordained. And then lo and behold, I had a third go coming back. And this time I decided it was time to really think how my love of poetry and my Christian faith, how my fairly orthodox Trinitarian theology on the one hand, and my feeling for intuition and imagination on the other, might talk to each other. And most of what I've written in the last 10 years or so has been an attempt not to prove that they can work together, because in me they're working together all the time, but to discover a little bit more about the mystery of how they work together.
Yeah. And I think it's really helpful. Your story is, like so many others, one in which the imagination and the theology and the experience come together. And very often I do this show on apologetics, and the vast majority of the time we're talking about logical arguments and philosophy and that sort of thing, and it's always a shame when almost they pass like ships in the night, the fact that actually most people's journey might involve a bit of that intellectual kind of putting the pieces together philosophically stuff, but a lot of it is also about the kind of world we want to exist and the way we engage our imagination and what would it look like and that sort of thing.
I think one of the most important things I discovered, and in a way both Barfield and Coleridge helped me to do this, just as indeed they helped Lewis, was to realise that the word imagination doesn't only and always cash out in imaginary, i.e. made up, not really there, that the imagination is also involved in clothing everything with meaning, in making a synthesis of everything, and that it's to sort of put it in one sentence, it's the discovery, which is a glad discovery, that the imagination is a truth-bearing faculty, that it's capable of bringing us to certain things that really are the case, which we could apprehend in no other way.
I sometimes like to think that if I had been a fly on the wall at the Inklings regular get-togethers down at the Eagle and Child in Oxford, Mark, it might have felt a little bit like an unbelievable show of sorts. Different people coming with their different ideas and, literature and things, and just having a great conversation over beer and a pipe, smoking a pipe and whatever. I mean, it's almost actually become something almost of folklore or something among something. There is this whole strain of romanticism around C.S. Lewis and his Oxford clique and so on in certain parts of the world. But what's your understanding of who the Inklings were and what they did, and the influence that obviously Tolkien, Lewis, Barfield had in that group?
I mean, it might have been a lot more combative than even some of your shows. There are recorded remarks of someone saying, "Oh, not more hobbits," and all that. Whether or not that's true, I don't know.
But expletive thrown in.
Exactly, yeah. But I think what they were, though, on sort of parallel journeys, and it was very much about this link between the imagination and the poetic, and then truth. As it's often discussed in more rational terms now for us. And I think the key linkage there is perception. It's, as it were, what you can see with your mind's eye. And this is, I think, they also found this very much in the Christian tradition. I don't know if this is quite true, but just on a casual reading, I think probably Jesus' most common remark, certainly in the Synoptic Gospels, is, have you got eyes to see? Have you got ears to hear? And I think the parables, which are probably a more or less distinctive teaching method of Jesus, one of the things which really helped me was realising they're not actually moral tales, because some of them are actually quite immoral if you read them in that way. What they are, though, are attempts to try and take you to an edge and see whether you can see the world in a completely different way. And Barfield got onto this because in his early life, when he was at Oxford with Lewis when they first met in the 1920s, he went through a period of depression, pretty serious, feeling that life was not up to it. And poetry helped him. But because what he tried to do with poetry was stay with the experience that words can give you, that a new world is opening up before you. Staying with that felt perception, not trying to close it down, not trying to sort of rationalise it away, but just seeing where that channel can lead you. And for me too, that was a key moment when I started to listen to Jesus, as it were, as someone who was doing a similar thing, who was, as William Blake put it, was Christ the imagination. And that was a pivotal moment for me to see that this was almost an invitation to move into worlds that are right here, but that at the time I had absolutely no perception of at all.
What at the time that he began, contributing to the Inklings, was Barfield's position where on faith, as it were? What kind of, did he describe himself as a Christian at that point?
No, he grew up in a sort of neutral family, and he was very influenced too, though, when he was doing his work on poetry, he was very influenced by anthroposophy, which is a sort of a Christian heretical group, you might say. It's unorthodox, at least. And he felt that the founder of anthroposophy, Rudolf Steiner, discovered a lot of things which he was onto as well. He was subsequently baptised as an Anglican.
He was, I think one of the things about that early, this is pre-Inklings, really. The friendship with Barfield precedes all of that. And we think of, a lot of people now think, Lewis is a bit more orthodox and he's got to bring Barfield along with him, but Barfield helped Lewis out of it. But when they met, of course, when they actually met for the first time, Lewis was radically and angrily atheist and essentially materialist in his philosophy, and processing the sort of anger that came out of the experience of the Great War, and as it were, trying to find, very influenced by his sixth form tutor, whom he called the Great Knock, who was a sort of old-fashioned 19th century scientific rationalistic atheist. So Lewis describes his life at that time as being completely divided, where with his mind he was like, I'm not having any of this stuff and nonsense, we are all atoms concatenating about in the emptiness of the cosmos, But meantime he was secretly loving the Norse legends and reading up about, the Isles of the Hesperides. So he meets Barfield. And at that point, it would be perfectly fair to say that Barfield was a far more religious person than Lewis was, even though he wasn't a fully Orthodox Christian at that point. And it was Barfield who began a long conversation with Lewis, which was friendly but also combative. In fact, they nicknamed it the Great War, which for characters who had actually been through the Great War
was quite
anyway,
a title,
Basically, one of the things that made Barfield a hugely attractive person to Lewis was that it gave Lewis for the first time the hope that his guilty pleasure, which was mythology, might have a grain of truth in it.
Right.
And that was so exciting. And that actually, acknowledging that, became an important part of Lewis's journey to Christianity. I think, would you
agree with that?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that it's well known, if you're into C.S. Lewis, that he has this conversation with Tolkien one night.
That's been well chronicled, hasn't it?
Sort of, as it were, tipped him over the edge into Christianity. But I think the deep work, the long work over many years through this discussion called the Great War, was done very much with Lewis and Barfield. And Lewis, dedicated books to Barfield. Lucy in the Narnia stories is named after Barfield's eldest child. You don't have to infer much, actually. It's pretty explicit once you start looking.
That's interesting. And just to kind of explain where Tolkien fits into this mix, did he come along a little bit later after this this friendship had been established between Barfield and Lewis, and what was his role? You mentioned briefly that he's often spoken of as this stroll through Magdalen Gardens or something that sort of meant that the penny dropped in some way for Lewis. But what was, in your view, is that a good explanation of what happened?
Yeah, Tolkien was that little bit older, so he was already an academic when they were there as undergraduates, and Tolkien and Lewis met first of all, and I guess Barfield got drawn into the orbit as well.
Yeah, I think Barfield was at the slight disadvantage that he didn't at that stage actually live in Oxford. You know, he was kind of practicing as a lawyer, which he hated. You know, and then sort of sneaking up to Oxford to have a real life of the mind with his friends. But there is so the Tolkien friendship is certainly very important, and I do take the view that famous stroll on Addison's Walk really was what made the difference when Tolkien said, the things you love in mythology, in this one instance in the story of Jesus, have actually become history.
The true myth.
They've become the true myth. So your rational mind and your imagination finally not only point towards, but actually in the end come from the same source, which is Jesus, the Logos. But I don't think that conversation could have happened without Barfield. The interesting thing about Tolkien and Barfield is that Tolkien, who was a professor of Anglo-Saxon, you know, the youngest professor of Anglo-Saxon, and so knew his linguistics inside out, was so moved by Barfield's book, Poetic Diction, which takes the view that earlier languages indicate not just older ways of saying things, but actually an older way of seeing things, that the earlier language is a kind of more unified consciousness. Tolkien says somewhere in a letter to Lewis, I think, that as a lecturer, he would be just about to say something in his full professor, and he'd think, oh, I can't say that because of Barfield. You know, Barfield's theories of language
had
a huge influence on Tolkien, and I think also gave Tolkien confidence. I mean, Barfield was really saying, it's not the case that story and myth are an accidental byproduct of a language of grunts and groans, but much more that our mythopoeic imagination is the very thing that produces language. Language is itself myth-patterned, as it were, and elf-woven.
And obviously Tolkien was a committed Catholic pretty much, you know, most of his life, I think. And in that sense, as Lewis and Barfield were going on their own theological explorations and so on, would you say that he acted in some way as a sort of mentor to both of them in any way? Or I mean, I'm just interested to know what the kind of relationship was between the three of them as they started to work things out for themselves.
My sense of it is more as interlocutor. But I think Barfield did have this deep impact upon Tolkien, whereas in a way he had this transformative impact upon Lewis.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, words were key to it all. You know, they were all amazing linguists and philologists.
Yeah.
And in a way of summarising Barfield's insight was he felt that words have soul. That they're alive. They're not just signs that we use to point and grunt, as Malcolm was just saying, but they themselves convey this sort of living vitality of what it is to be conscious, to have experience. And that's why poetry works. You know, it's why novels work too. It's why when you read a novel, you don't just feel you've been told a report of a life. You experience the life. That is how deeply transformative and powerful words can be.
So could you explain for us then just what impact Barfield has had on your own journey at this point? Obviously, it was significant on Lewis, and perhaps you can tie into how that's become significant for you. Yeah,
so what he did was he gave me a big picture about the significance of Christianity, and particularly why this figure of Jesus became so seminal in the West, and then globally, I think. And it was to do with this idea about words. So if you take the idea that words have this kind of living quality, then if you study the history of words, you can see how consciousness has changed, how people's experience of what it is to be human has changed over time. They become fossils of consciousness, as he put it. And what he did was do that very work. In fact, Barfield's first book was called History in English Words, where he tried to tell us a history of the British Isles through the words as they pop up over the centuries.
Right.
And what he realised was that there was a kind of pivotal moment when words, instead of conveying meaning from the outside in, which is what they did say in the time of the ancient Greeks, Homer, and I think actually in the oldest bits of the Bible, if you read the very oldest bits of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, it's very clear that Yahweh is being experienced as this presence force in nature. You know, he is sort of identified with Mount Zion, and that presence moves from the outside in and forms who you are. And that gradually shifts in the centuries, particularly before Jesus' birth, where a kind of inner vitality starts to emerge. And Barfield thought you can literally track this with words. And Jesus comes at this pivotal moment where the inside has sort of fully come to life. And I think it's one of the reasons why Jesus makes otherwise quite odd comments about it's not what you take in that counts, but what comes out of you that counts, and so on. And this is normally reduced to a kind of moral imperative. But I think it's saying something more profound, which is that we now have become almost, well, certainly we now experience life in a very, very different way. We become individuals in the sense that you and I experience it, and that what happens inside us, the microcosm, if you like, can mirror the macrocosm, but with full responsibility, full freedom, full imaginative engagement. We're called into a completely different way of engaging with the divine that got caught up in the figure of Jesus and then in people's reflections upon him and launched this new dispensation.
Would this be sort of along the lines of what Jesus says about the kingdom of heaven is within you? Is that the sense in which Jesus has kind of taken it from the outside to this experience from within, by which we engage?
Yeah, very much. I mean, for me, that's a really pivotal remark. Certainly in Luke, the kingdom's not here, it's not there, it's within you. And I think that it's one of those comments which Jesus must have said himself, because it's pretty clear that a lot of his early disciples and followers didn't really understand what he was talking about. They kind of wrestle with it. I think you see it particularly in in a way, the first great Christian struggle with the notion of the second coming, of the apocalypse. And you can read, say, in Paul, a series of different stances that he takes, I think, as he tries to wrestle with what Jesus was really revealing. And then finally, I think, comes to the sense and the awareness that actually he himself is taking on the mind of Christ, that he's becoming a co-worker with Christ. And that is the sort of the full new sense of things which Jesus revealed to him.
Just before I bring Malcolm in on this, you're obviously putting a lot, from the book into a very short sound bites there, but when you speak of Jesus, the last inkling, and the evolution of consciousness, in what sense is Jesus sort of this new paradigm for a sense of consciousness and experience and that sort of thing? Is it just that he's the right person at the right time to kind of be that shift into a new way of understanding God and oneself?
I think he is the person who, for the first time in the fullest possible sense, has a notion of, you might say, his own I amness as a human individual that can be completely transparent to the divine I am, as is revealed in the Old Testament. And that sort of complete bringing into the world of the divine I am in the human individual, I think that's what people sensed in the person of Jesus and then tried to work out.
Well, we'll come back to how that cashes out in terms of, obviously, typical Trinitarian theology and so on. But Malcolm, what is this kind of where you've read Barfield, the way you've engaged his thought?
I think it might be helpful just to sort of, in summing up Barfield's, just to use a couple of terms that Barfield himself used about consciousness. He used this phrase, evolution of consciousness, but he thought we as human beings were kind of on a journey of development, and he thought the first stage was what he called original participation. What he means by original participation, original just means in the beginning, was that, and he has very strong linguistic evidence for this. He says, we tend to think of out there as just a bunch of dead stuff. And it happens to be, there's a wind blowing. And then what people used to think was everybody always saw the world as full of dead stuff. And then if somebody wanted to express their inner thoughts, they said, the wind is a little bit like a spirit blowing, or the wind is a little bit like breathing, and I can draw a little person blowing the wind out, as though they'd made it up afterwards. Basically, what Barfield showed pretty definitively was that when you look at the actual words that people used back then, in Greek, for example, the word pneuma means wind, blowing. It means breath, breathing, but it also absolutely and always means spirit.
Right.
And everything we mean by spirit, both, if you like, the Holy Spirit out there and the inner spirit there. Now, the Greeks weren't short of a word or two, pretty sophisticated language. So Barfield says, why is it that they would have the same word for three things that we split up and need different words for? Like, to take the Latin words taken from pneuma, pneuma, of course, lives to spirit, spiritus. We've got respiration on the one hand and inspiration on the other, and we think they're separate things. But Barfield showed pretty conclusively, because it's the same in Hebrew and in Latin, that actually for an ancient person with this original participation, you couldn't breathe in without feeling that God had breathed into you. You couldn't breathe out. You couldn't feel the wind without knowing that it was the breath of God. But all that stuff we think of as personal was always everywhere out there, which is great, except that it's not yours. You don't have a personal spiritual experience. You just are part of a bigger thing. So what Barfield thought was that way of changing gradually changes. And the world is, as it were, it's as though all the meaning that was out there gradually comes in here. Now, that can be traumatic for us because suddenly we look out there and it's just a bunch of dead stuff.
Right.
So Barfield thought there must be a turning point where, having had all that meaning, as it were, and joy and beauty and personhood that we used to think was everywhere, all the gods and goddesses, as being, no, it's just me in my little islanded skull, that could not be the end point of the story, because that would leave us as like meaningless little bubbles of consciousness stuck in
an
a
otherwise
machine,
dead universe, yes.
So he said, wait a minute, there's got to be a turning point where this time we've received that so we can have the gift of being persons and free. Now, can we actually breathe it back out in such a way that the world is clothed with it again, but we're in a personal relationship? And as he began to articulate, he realized, wait a minute, what I'm talking about is divinity coming down, being inside a person, being breathed out again, and redeeming the world. Now, where have I heard that
Where have
before?
I heard that story before?
And he began to see that in the story of the incarnation, actually death, which is the experience of alienation, resurrection, and especially the sending of the Spirit, he breathes on them. That, I mean, at its most remote, you could say this is an analogy or an example. But actually, I think Barfield believed that Jesus was himself that turning point of the cosmos, when everything that's been sent in can now be shared, and that we can share Christ's consciousness, which is both personal like ours, but also totally, as you said, open to the divine, transparent to the divine. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm just finding it all fascinating. I mean, these are new ideas, or at least ideas I've heard, but interesting to see how they were obviously catalysed in the thinking of Barfield and so on, and obviously how it all linked in with the person of Jesus. We're going to go to our first break, and then we'll continue to dig in and unpack this whole topic today. My guests today, talking about Lewis, Tolkien, Owen Barfield, the Inklings, and making sense of faith, are Mark Vernon and Malcolm Guite. Mark Vernon's new book, A Secret History of Christianity, is what we're talking about today, and we'll continue the conversation in a moment's time. For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter. Got a really interesting discussion for you today on the show, looking at C.S. Lewis, JRR Tolkien and Owen Barfield, how the Inklings made sense of faith today. My guests are Mark Vernon and Malcolm Guite, and we've heard a little bit about the history of the Inklings, this group of academics, thinkers and writers who met regularly through the 30s and to the 50s in Oxford, and the most famous members, of course, being Tolkien and Lewis. But Owen Barfield was a significant sort of influence on both of them and others, and has been a significant influence on Mark Vernon, one of my guests on today's show, who, until relatively recently, I think, Mark, would have described yourself as agnostic. I don't know if you have a label for what you are now. I mean, are you happy to call yourself a Christian now? What do you just prefer not to use labels?
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, if we get a chance to talk about what that means, of course, that's always helpful, which we do. So that's great. Yeah.
Well, that's what we're doing today, I suppose. And obviously, we've just heard in that last section, Malcolm sort of giving a sort of helpful kind of history almost of how Barfield in his thinking sort of saw Jesus as this conduit for a radical change and almost the instantiation, I suppose, of this new way of understanding the world around us, and that the divine, having become very personalised, now reaches out again into the world and fills it in the person of Jesus. So that's all. I just find that all utterly fascinating. The question is, I can hear a lot of people saying, well, that sounds great, but where does it leave us in terms of, reality? Let's say, was Jesus the Son of God? Did he change reality? Was somehow history pivoted on this unique person in that very time and place in a small, corner of the world? So what's your take on that? How do you kind of, does this all centre down ultimately on one individual?
I think you can certainly point to quite concrete things that start to become possible to experience and think about in the first centuries after Jesus that result from the life of Jesus. So, for example, there was no notion of free will in the ancient world, and it's about the 2nd century with Justin Martyr that the notion of free will starts to be really talked about, as if an individual can make free choices in life and choose to know who they really are. That was the sort of older sense. So free will now is taken to be absolutely fundamental to who we are as human beings. But it has a history, and the history is deeply connected to the notion of Jesus. A slightly more flippant example is that the notion of plagiarism starts to come in as well. So it was pretty standard in the ancient world to, say, call your text after Plato, even if you weren't Plato, because you saw yourself in the Platonic tradition, this much more collective sense of what it is to be a human being, which Malcolm was talking about. But plagiarism starts to pop up, and poets start saying, wait a minute, did you really write that? This isn't quite you, it's actually me. So that sense of being an individual with a kind of autonomy starts to emerge as well. So you can look to things like that. In a way, a more direct experience for me that I think I can see comes about because of what Jesus brought actually comes from psychotherapy. I work as a psychotherapist actually now, and one of the things that's really fascinating about psychotherapy is, in a way, the effort to help people break out of a kind of two-dimensional experience of life. For various reasons, people can get locked into a very flat earth, you might say, and it causes them a lot of trouble often and causes a lot of suffering. And then what you're trying to do in psychotherapy, I think, is to ease up on that so that you can start to move into a three-dimensional world. And that three-dimensional world, you particularly notice it in the therapy room quite tangibly when time starts to take on a different shape. So, if you're in the flat earth when the clock is ticking and you're watching the clock and 5 minutes feels like half an hour and so on, and you're sort of struggling to work out how to shift things in the room. But the minute time starts to become a bit more timeless, you're sinking to a deeper level of what it is to be human. And I think that increasingly that level is moving away from, as it were, the material human being, the biological human being, you might say, and moving into the spiritual dimensions of who we are, the soulful dimensions of who we are. And ultimately, I think it's even possible to discern the kind of eternal dimensions of who we are. And again, you feel this quite tangibly in psychotherapy, because one of the things you realise is that something that happened to you 40 or 50 years ago, even 60 or 70 years ago, if you're old enough, is quite as alive inside you now as it was when it first happened. This is sort of psychological fact now, that how we treat very young children impacts them for all their lives. And for me, my own psychotherapy, which I went through as part of my training, that realization helped me with my own struggles. But it was also a spiritual realization that this timeless sense, this divine sense, is actually all around us, and we can realign ourselves to it. And again, I think that Jesus first sort of brought that into the world in a full and possible sense, because it's a kind of wisdom. It's not just like something you need to be told. It's a sort of practice. It's an unfolding, and it is sort of passed down the generations, I think, because you first get a whiff of it when you half sense it in someone else. I think this is what it means to be a mystic or to be a saint. That you get a smell of it and you want it, and then you have to do the work on yourself, and gradually it unfolds and reveals itself to you.
I think the saying of Jesus that might speak particularly into what Mark's just said, particularly about time, and about the kind of consciousness that Jesus offers to those who are in him and he's in them, is the very mysterious saying, in St. John 8, I think, where he says, Abraham rejoiced to see my day, he saw it and was glad. And they say, oh, you're not even 40 years old, and have you seen Abraham? And he says, before Abraham was, I am. Now, it's a very interesting playing with tenses, isn't it? Before Abraham was, I am. It's not like I used to be or I was then. Now, as we know, he's actually riffing on the divine name that, Yahweh, tell the children of Israel, says to Moses, that I am has sent you. And he seems to be linking to the idea that one of the things that God is God is a person, he's I am. And that our own ability to say I am, our own ability to be a person in the present, is given by God. It sort of wells up from God.
We're made in his image.
We're made in his image, and part of the image is the power to say I am.
Right.
But Jesus clearly says it in a very big way, when kind of capital letters, and they pick up stones, to stone him. I mean, uniquely, you might say, Jesus is saying that Yahweh, that I am, is standing in front of you. But he's also saying to everybody who follows him, you too can, in some sense, participate in this. Let my Father will come and dwell in you. If you see, and like he says to the woman at the well, I will give you a well of water welling up within you to eternal life.
Yeah,
eternal life doesn't mean actually necessarily going on forever. It means beyond time altogether. And I would say that one of the characteristics of a certain form of Christian mysticism, right the way through history, sometimes it's more hidden than others, depending on the culture that it's flourishing in, is people in Christ contemplating Christ's aliveness now, suddenly feeling that the depth of who they are in him is untouched by time, is already, it's like Paul when he says, you have died and your life is hidden with Christ.
I was about to say
God.
the exact same verse is what reminded me of it.
So the trouble is, I think, in a weird way, even though there's lots of stuff about Owen Barfield and anthroposophy and stuff that Lewis had problems with, and I would probably have problems with, there's something about the way he writes that makes you thrilled, and you say, wait a minute, he's talking about a real Christian mystical experience here. And he's not just talking about it in a pious way. He's saying that's an actual objective reality that anybody can have, because that eternity is around, and that's very exciting.
Yeah. Is this sort of the way you've begun to conceive of your own, for want of a better word, relationship with Christ, or ability to engage with Christ as the centre of reality in that way?
Yeah, very much. I mean, in a way, the psychotherapy, to mention that again, that's a lot of personal stuff, kind of working out my own neuroses and so on, and the impact of my immediate past. But what completes it is the sense that it doesn't actually just stop with me. And in some way, what psychotherapy enables you to do is not just be caught up in your own stuff, but begin to be able to put that to one side, create a bit of a sense of space, and see that there's a whole lot more that becomes available to you, you can become aware of, that in a way is much bigger than you. It's this return to a different kind of participation. Barfield called it final participation.
It's interesting to hear you mention the psychotherapy thing, because about a year ago, I was contacted by someone who's came on the show a long time ago as a very sort of materialist atheist, but who was involved in psychology and that sort of thing. And he got in touch, said, I didn't really know who else to ask this of, Justin, but he'd gone through an emotional crisis of sorts, really, where he thought he sort of had the world worked out, essentially, and the way things work. But he'd done something to an ex-partner that he felt utterly ashamed of, and suddenly his well thought out ways of understanding the world no longer seemed to make sense, because I think he's been somewhat influenced by people like Jordan Peterson and others who talk about the malevolence that somehow is there at the heart of people, and he saw that expressed in something he couldn't control, and he couldn't give an account for it in the way, the way he thought the world worked. And it had begun to lead him on a quest that sounds a little bit like what you guys have been describing of, there's more to me than the synapses and brain working and psychology that sometimes it gets reduced to, and I need to find a bigger explanation for this, and why I am the way I am, and why I would do that thing that I just find so utterly, which I can't believe I did, essentially. And it just strikes me that sometimes people do reach this point, and it's where they realise that the kind of the metaphysic that has up to that point given them some kind of explanation of the world no longer seems to do the job in terms of who they are and that sort of thing. And I suspect very often this isn't just an intellectual journey, but an emotional one for many people.
Completely. I think that the intellectual rationalisation follows on from the direct experience. Yeah. And where in the medieval period someone might have gone on pilgrimage if it had an experience like that, visited a shrine, taken time out of life in that way, I think it's increasingly common now for people to turn to some sort of psychology or psychotherapy in order to go on this inner journey in that way. I think there's a lot of evidence for it around and about in our culture, the need for this. You mentioned Jordan Peterson, the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, but you might look to Buddhism as well, and these kind of inner practices, which in a way it's a sort of technique that you kind of learn to pay attention to inner life in order that inner life can then show itself. And for me, that's been very helpful purely at a sort of practical level, learning the technique. But it's led me sort of back into a new appreciation of Christianity and what that might be about.
I was going to ask as well then, from your point of view, Malcolm, a lot of people will hear what's being said, but certain sort of concerns will be raised. This sounds an awful lot like Eastern mysticism, New Agey stuff, Deepak Chopra, or whatever, and we've all been told that's all a bit dodgy and we shouldn't really, go too near that stuff. But how is what you're describing as this kind of understanding of Christianity in Christ distinctively Christian, as opposed to a sort of a kind of we're all part of a universal consciousness and that kind of thing?
I think first of all, you can use a language of that there is consciousness first, that there is I am, and that we are given our consciousness. That language is, in a sense, it's either the case or it isn't, and it seems to be the case. Is where it becomes Christian is clearly where it focuses onto the person of Christ. The classic statement, in Corinthians would be, when this very question about the wise man and the debater of the age, he says, I resolved to know nothing among you save Christ Jesus, crucified, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Very interesting. So we are talking about power and wisdom here. So I would say, for a thing to be distinctively Christian, we have to take all those big fields and say, yes, but how does that come to us in Christ? And the thing that allowed Lewis to stay friends with and feel in Christian fellowship with Barfield, in spite of the fact that Barfield's anthroposophy and Rudolf Steiner, Rudolf Steiner's got some pretty weird ideas, but both Steiner but Barfield specifically really thought that in Christ Jesus, that divine consciousness is made fully available within a human life and changes things and is a turning point, not just for us as individuals, but in a sense for the cosmos. The other thing I would throw in terms of keeping why I still kind of stay in conversation with Barfield, even though I don't, agree with everything that he said. I think my worry about Barfield is that his feeling of your change of consciousness and that you've got to involve in this, that can become, as it were, a work. Right. Of salvation, you can become like, I've got to get my consciousness
right. I've got to achieve a certain level of enlightenment.
And I think I want more room for the divine action.
Okay.
So that's my reservation. But one thing that I think is really important about Lewis and Barfield and Lewis's friendship with Barfield is that it's not yes, it's about an emotional change. Yes, it's about conversion and all those things. But for both men, it was also always about reason, about the search philosophically for truth about what is the case. So there's a wonderful poem of C.S. Lewis's where he's struggling with the fact that he's got this great capacity for logic on the one hand, and he's got this deeply imaginative emotional life, and he says, one of them is like the goddess Athene, and the other is like the goddess Demeter in Athens, and he says, tempt not Athene, but wound not in her fertile pains Demeter. And he says, who will reconcile in me both maid and mother, who make a concord of the depth and height, who make imagination's dim exploring touch, ever report the same as intellectual sight. Now that was also a quest for Barfield, and however different they were in other ways, both men wanted something which was not only imaginatively satisfying, but rationally could be shown to be tenable.
Yes.
Both men thought the meeting of reason and imagination in an event that you can get hold of with both sides of your mind happens in the Christ event. Now, one of them may be much more oddly mystical than the other, and the other may be prone to what Lewis, in a bit of self-parody, called my bow-wow dogmatism. But at the end, they both felt that the resolution of these big different ways of seeing things, the quest for an objective truth, the realization of a subjective transformation, that Christ was the way those two things came together.
Somehow managed to bring them together.
I mean, a clinch word for me is the word incarnation. I don't know if you've quite said it yet, but this is the meaning of the incarnation. It is something that happened 2,000 years ago, but what that facilitates is the possibility for incarnation now. And this has always been picked up in the Christian mystical tradition. I think that we're sort of after the Reformation, when a lot of that became suspect amongst the reformers. Inner life particularly became problematic again. I understand this now as like another turn of this development of inner life. It's like another moment of disenchantment with the world.
When you say this, do you mean sort of in the post-rationalism Enlightenment world we live in, where everything's been explained in a kind of by atoms and molecules, kind of in the way that Lewis had kind of adopted his atheism?
Yeah, very much.
We're now swinging back to a kind of, okay, that story's not going to do enough for us.
Yeah, so we're rediscovering, like you say, about the story of the person who contacted you, we're rediscovering things about ourselves, often in very painful ways. This is the dying and rising. I think that's another reason why it's very Christian, is because it's always dying and rising. It's not just, as it were, a step into a perfect future. There is a real struggle here. There's a real passion here. So both the incarnation and the passion, the two pivotal parts of the Christian story, are absolutely essential. And to my, Barfield completely bought into that. He really saw that.
Do you think of yourself as more a Barfield than Lewis then at this point, Mark, in terms of the way you engage Christianity?
I do. I mean, it's partly just a sort of question of taste. I've always been more a Tolkien man than a Lewis man, The Lord of the Rings really got me. The Narnia stories kind of interested me.
Is that because... does Lewis just lay it on more thick with the Narnia stories, and Tolkien never kind of has to very explicitly give the correlation, the analogy between Christ and Gandalf or whatever, but it's there if you're willing to see it, sort of thing?
My suspicion is that Lewis never quite fully trusted the imagination as truth-bearing. He certainly moved on from his earlier life where he thought it could add colour to things, but at times he lets himself go into it. But on the whole, I think that he's just that little bit wary. Maybe this is the bow-wow dogmatism side of him. Whereas I think, Tolkien and Barfield really trusted the imagination. They did see it as the spirit speaking to them.
What's your view on that differentiation between...
Yeah.
I mean, we know that Lewis and Tolkien had some differences and views about the way to do this.
I think that's a very fair comment. I think there are definitely two sides to Lewis, and even though in the end I think he did know that Christ reconciled his reason and imagination, he had quite a strong sense of the fall, quite a strong sense of the way in which all these faculties in us are disordered and, as it were, facing the wrong direction. And he was much more afraid, I think, than Barfield was, that the imaginative stuff, which could, of course, potentially bring truth, might also deceive. And therefore he always wanted to, as it were, hold it to account in a particular way. Barfield, I think, trusted much more in the, if you like, the Lord, the Spirit, shaping things for us. It's interesting looking. I wrote the chapter on C.S. Lewis as a poet for the Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis, so I really got into Lewis's poetry. And one of the things that occurred to me as I read it was that Lewis is much, much more Barfieldian as a poet.
Right.
It's almost as though when he allows himself to be a poet, his imagination is able to imagine what original participation might have felt like.
Was there a poem that you had in mind for that?
Yeah, there's a wonderful poem of his called The Adam at Night, in which Lewis is basically imagining what it would have been like to have been an unfallen human being, genuinely, as it were, close to God in there. And as I read it, I thought, this is like a perfect description of what Barfield's original participation is, the sense of would have felt like. So the idea is that Adam you don't need sleep before the fall.
Okay.
So this is a description of Adam, as it were, altering his mode of consciousness to partake of the whole earth, to have a kind of planetary consciousness, which, sounds very kind of new age, but this is Lewis channeling his inner Barfield. Okay. I think it's beautiful. It goes like this. The he here is Adam, right? He would lie relaxed, enormous, under a sky starry as never since. He would set ajar the door of his mind. Into him thoughts would pour, other than days. He rejoined earth, his mother, He melted into her nature. Gradually he felt as though through his own flesh the elusive growth, the hardening and spreading of roots in the deep garden, in his veins the wells filling with the silver rains, and thrusting down far under his rock crust, finger-like, rays from the heavens that probed, bringing to bloom the gold and diamond in his dark womb. The seething central fires moved with his breathing. Isn't that amazing?
It is.
It's like
Beautiful.
Feeling earth consciousness for having it. Now, then in the poem that finishes in the morning, they wake up and they become more distinctively human again and walk in the garden.
Yeah.
But for a while, because they are, as it were, they're the consciousness and intelligence arisen physically out of the earth that God has put into the earth to be conscious for it. Now, those are all pretty Barfieldian ideas. And I think when Lewis is in the mode where he's either imagining before the fall or beautifully imagining the kingdom restored, then he really lets his Barfield out.
Do you, in where you stand now on Christianity, Mark, have an understanding or concept of the fall in that way, that there's some sense in which we have been, if you like, cut off from this original participation, or whatever word you want to use, and in what sense does Christ open the door to, I suppose, a restoration of that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I pick up on the Christian tradition that can, in this strange way, say, "Oh, happy fall." That there was something in God's wisdom that actually became possible because of the fall. A slightly less esoteric way of putting it would be to say that it's when we become fallen that we become individuals. It's when we experience, maybe to a small degree, maybe to a large degree, our sense of cut-offness from God, if that's what the fall is. Then we get a sense of ourselves through that experience of alienation and lostness, of falling short, of limitation. But it doesn't stop there. And that fall can lead to redemption. So that it's part of this process of both knowing you're an individual, but knowing you can become an individual that's fully transparent again to the divine, but with all the benefits of being an individual.
And what role does Christ play in that? Because in a, if you like, standard understanding, doctrinally, we would speak of Christ's death and resurrection as being the events that kind of, when we trust in it, will bring us into that relationship with God. Now, I don't know if that kind of is in any way translated into your kind of take on Christianity and what role those particular aspects of Christ's life obviously have to play.
I mean, I think the trusting in it is the first step, but the really knowing it is the full step.
Right.
That's what it is to be converted, I think. And there is a kind of moment, you might say, of conversion where you trust it, but that's just the beginning of your conversion. And Christ is called the second Adam by Paul. And I think that's a deep, deep insight into the nature of Jesus, which both brings all that the fall was, as it were, into the present, but then realises the other side of the fall, which is the return to the divine, which is to know God once more.
This is a good moment to just pause again and go to another break, and we'll be able to wrap up this really interesting conversation between my guests Mark Vernon and Malcolm Guite on the show today. If you want to read more about this, Mark's new book is called A Secret History of Christianity, Jesus, the Last Inkling and the Evolution of Consciousness. I'll make sure there are links to both my guests as well from today's show. You want to check out some of Malcolm's recent stuff as well. He's got volumes of poetry available, and Mariner, A Voyage with Samuel Taylor Coleridge was the big book that came out a couple of years ago on the huge sort of look at that famous poem and the life of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. But we'll continue and finish off today's discussion in a short moment's time.
If you listen to Unbelievable with Justin Brierley on Premier Christian Radio and enjoy the conversations between Christians and skeptics, then this is the perfect app for you. For the latest updates, podcasts, videos, articles, bonus content and much more, download the Premier Unbelievable app today.
It's been such an interesting time talking about Lewis, Tolkien, Owen Barfield, the Inklings, Making Sense of Faith with Mark Vernon and Malcolm Guite on today's show. Again, there's links to both of them from the show page if you want to find out more. markvernon.com. You can find out more about the book there. It's called A Secret History of Christianity. malcolmguite.com. Guite spelled Guite. If you want to find out more about Malcolm's work and so on. But I've sort of, this has opened up new information to me, about the journey that Barfield and Lewis and Tolkien went on, but which just seems to key into a lot of what's going on currently in the present sort of cultural conversation between people like Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris and others who are talking about, in a post-Christian materialistic age, how do we get meaning? What's, the fact that people are flocking to these debates and talks by these, intellectuals, makes me feel like there is something there. People are still feeling like I can't be satisfied, and just piling on more technology, more ability to amuse ourselves isn't ultimately going to do it. And so do you feel Barfield and what you've been talking about in your book here, Mark, has a message for the church today and how we're going to engage this generation, which is, if you like, is getting on for 100 years on now from when Barfield and Lewis and others were putting their finger on these issues in their age? Yeah, I do, and it comes in with people like Peterson and Sam Harris. You might just observe that it's often consciousness that they're talking about. Yes. And it may be what is the nature of consciousness, that's sort of the objective side of it, if you like. But it's also what is our experience of what it is to be human, and how might that change? So Peterson, he says many things, but quite a common theme in what he says is you've got to take responsibility for your own life. And for me, that feels like this taking in and trying to get some account, some fuller awareness of what's going on for you in your inner life, in your interiority. Because that's always the first step to discovering there's more than just your interiority. So it's why trying to speak the truth about yourself has always been realised to be a way of finding a cure for your trouble. Because it actually enables you to see much more than just your trouble. It's often very painful and very difficult and takes a while. But and what would this look like then in terms of, I don't know, an average Christian or churchgoer? What changes at this point in the way they communicate Christianity, the way they reach that generation who are obviously on that search?
Yeah, I would like to see the church get much more into personal transformation.
Okay.
I put it like that. I think the Church of England, certainly the church which I know the best, is very, very good at things like social justice. It completely understands that, the kind of moral imperative of the gospel. But what, for me, it often falls short is providing the context and also the discernment, the intellectual engagement that helps people to really develop their inner life and to know that the incarnation can happen in them as much as it happened in the story that they celebrate around Jesus. So it's got. I think there's a shift away from a kind of the moral impact of the gospel, more to what always was the mystical tradition. Again, I think this has sort of got rather lost since the Reformation. It's a very deep and wonderful tradition, but it was ripped out in 10 years in this country at the Reformation with the closure of the religious houses. That's not surprising. It's a sort of trauma, but I do feel that the broader culture now is telling the churches in a way, look, people want this. They want to recover this sense of inner life, this mystical tradition. And Christianity has got the full resources to unpack that for people.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's there we're quoting John's Gospel a lot. It's interesting, which is the kind of mystical gospel. But, Nicodemus going, well, like, what exactly do I have to do? Give me the task-oriented thing, And Jesus using this extraordinary language, saying you must be born again, which is one thing to say. But often you get that phrase is used and was in the States used as a badge of a certain kind of Christianity, I'm born again. But actually Jesus says you must be born again of water and the Spirit. Now, that's these flowing things that sustain all life, the thing you breathe. It's a process, it's a change, and, it's taking what's out there, these beautiful flowing things in the world, and realising they can be in here. So I think there's a constant invitation to sort of personal transformation. And I agree with Mark that we need to do that. I also do think that we need to be a bit more upfront about being intellectually serious about the questions.
Okay.
Like, one of the things that I think we sometimes do, I see this in some, in universities, where particularly the more kind of conservative Christian groups are almost saying to people, forget about your questions, here's my answers.
Right.
And one of the things I see chaplaincy is doing is saying, let's stay with the question for quite a long time. What is it we're after? I mean, I'm not so familiar with the Jordan Peterson stuff, but I do know that this question of meaning
Has been around a long time.
Has been around. So there's an essay by Barfield, which I think is one of the best ways into Barfield. It's called The Rediscovery of Meaning. That's now been published again by Barfield's grandson, also called Owen Barfield. It's really weird. I once got a message on Cambridge that said, Owen Barfield wants to speak to you. And I was thinking,
yes, I get emails from Owen Barfield.
Anyway, he wrote this in the 60s, right, in the late 50s.
Yes.
Of the last century. But listen to how contemporary this feels.
Go on.
Amid all the menacing signs that surround us in the middle of this 20th century, perhaps the one which fills thoughtful people with the greatest foreboding is the growing general sense of meaninglessness. It is this which underlies most of the other threats. How is it that the more able man becomes to manipulate the world to his advantage, the less he can perceive any meaning in it? That's a really sharp question. I mean, if I was a young atheist or agnostic and somebody of any faith openly said that, I'd be interested in the conversation.
Right. Yeah.
And maybe just to add to that, I think there's a reason why consciousness is often at the nub of these questions. What is consciousness? Because it's almost like the grit in the materialist shell that won't go away, but might form the pearl, as it were. Yes, yeah.
That's fascinating stuff. Look, I've just so enjoyed this conversation, both of you, Malcolm and Mark. Thank you so much for taking the time to come in. Obviously, a good starting point for continuing to look into this Secret History of Christianity, Jesus, the Last Inkling, and the Evolution of Consciousness by Mark Vernon. I think you have provided an endorsement as well.
I have, yeah. I think it's a very good book. I mean, there's lots, of course, I want to have the conversation. In a way, I think, for example, my friendship with Mark, there's a little bit of an echo in a smaller way between the Lewis-Barfield friendship.
Right. You're
just
more
as
the Barfield,
Barfield. Yeah, Barfield was more left field than Lewis. But I think I've endorsed this book, and I want to keep this conversation open,
right? Because
Mark is putting his finger on something really important for the church, I think. And even though, I mean, you were a priest and I'm still a priest, so there's a difference. I'm hanging on in there with organised Christianity, and you've stepped aside from it. But I still think what you're on about here is something central to the renewal of the church.
Very good. Thank you both for being with me. It's been fascinating, as always. But if you want to find out more, there is links to both my guests, Mark Vernon and Malcolm Guite, from today's show, premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. For the moment, Mark and Malcolm, thank you very much for being with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.